if we talk about the birth of the British film industry, stands to reason there had to be a moment when the sperm reached the egg. Now, we can have an interesting discussion over lunch about which of the two protagonists I'm going to introduce you to was the egg or the sperm, but what I'm going to focus on is the moment of fertilization, because we know when that was. It happened on a sunny morning in late March 1895 in Park Road, Barnet, outside a house that had been called Clovelly Cottage. And I think that maybe, if we put that moment under the microscope, then perhaps we could see the cells dividing and learn a little bit about what happened after that, which is why I'm asking the question, what happened at Clovelly Cottage? Now, it's a point worth repeating that the British public didn't see moving pictures, filmed moving pictures originally on a screen. They saw it in a wooden box called the Kinetoscope, which was Edison's invention, created really by William Dixon. And when people stooped uncomfortably to look into the slot, what they saw were very short films, novelty acts and other stuff. The image was only 1 inch wide, viewed through a magnifying lens. It moved continuously in a long loop in the kinetoscope, and the only reason people saw it apparently in one place is that customers saw just the briefest glimpse through a sort of fast rotating slit. So they would have seen something that looked very, very lifelike. The speed was 46 frames a second, so with almost no flicker, but at that speed the films themselves would only have, a 40-foot film lasted about 15 seconds. There's a reason why I'm telling you all of that. We'll get to that. Well, Britons first got their chance to peer into the kinetoscope on, 18th of October, 1894, at 70 Oxford Street, where the first parlour was opened, and they were soon springing up around London, around the whole country. There were two American businessmen, Maguire and Borkus, that had got the rights to distribute the kinetoscope in Britain and around Europe, but they were not the only players in the game. There are a couple of Greek-named entrepreneurs, Georgiadis and Tragedis, who'd acquired a few kinetoscopes in the US, and they'd set up their own parlour. Now, there are no known photographs of Georgiadis and Tragedis, but I did find this artist's impression of them encountering the kinetoscope for the first time. Now, the thing was that buying imported Edison kinetoscopes, that by the official route, that was an expensive business, but they figured if they could find somebody to build kinetoscopes for them in London, that would be a lot cheaper and they could make more profit. But who? Well, they made the acquaintance of a young chap, Henry Short, and he proposed someone that he knew. This was a maker of precision scientific instruments who worked in Hatton Garden, and he took them to meet the man in question. And that man, as you might know, was Robert Paul. Now, Paul had set up his own business just 3 years before, at the tender age of 21, and since he was skilled in both electrical and mechanical engineering, he was kind of a perfect choice for duplicating an electromechanical device. And when Paul discovered that the Edison kinetoscope was not patented in Britain, he happily agreed to do the job. But Paul was not simply making something that was similar to a kinetoscope. He was making machines that looked indistinguishable from authentic Edison kinetoscopes, right down to the leaf inlay on their side. And in 1894, as now, that is illegal. It's known as passing off, and it doesn't matter whether it's a Nike trainer or an Edison kinetoscope, you can't make something look exactly like another manufacturer's product and sell it as if it was. So sure enough, Maguire and Borkus got onto this, took Georgiadis and Tragedis to court, and their partnership ended quite abruptly. But meanwhile, Paul, who was well out of all of that, figured that if he put a nameplate on the kinetoscopes, he could carry on selling them, and there was good business in doing so, so he continued production. But there's something that's very important to understand. This whole global kinetoscope business was predicated on the existence of just one camera in the world, and that was at the Edison Works in West Orange, New Jersey. It's functioning, known only to a handful of trusted people. And it was a beast of a thing. It was an electrically powered device so heavy that it was moved on rails within a specially constructed studio within the grounds of the work, known as the Black Maria. The camera couldn't go anywhere to film things, so things had to be brought in front of the camera. So, Maguire and Borkus let it be known that nobody who bought a copied kinetoscope would be allowed access to authentic Edison films. And that really put the kibosh on Paul's promising little new sideline. Paul immediately saw that the only way out of these difficulties was to make his own films. It was just one teensy catch. He had absolutely no idea how to do that. But once again, Henry Shaw acted as the midwife. He knew just the person who might be able to help Paul. He was his boss at the photographic place that he worked, and that was Birt Acres, perfect man for the job. Now, Birt Acres is often referred to in the literature as, you know, a photographer, but he was a lot more than that. Not only was he a much praised photographer, but more importantly, from about 1889 onwards, he became one of the most highly regarded, most sought after technical experts in photography in Britain at that moment in time. And in 1892, he was headhunted by the firm of Elliott & Son, who were expanding their photographic printing business in Barnet, and they offered him the post of general manager. And that post came with a substantial home right next to the works. And indeed, they used his credibility as a photographer and the medals that he won to promote their own business. So Acres was in demand all over the country to give talks. He'd also experimented with simple sequence photographic devices. So when Henry Shaw brought him to Paul, he was bringing an expert whose skills perfectly complemented Paul's for the project that he had in mind. So the division of labour was really, really clear. Acres brought the technical and creative knowledge of photography and access to laboratory facilities, obviously, whilst Paul had the engineering knowledge and a fully fitted workshop. So when the 25-year-old Paul and the 40-year-old Acres first met on the 4th of February 1895, there was a great sense of urgency for the project, as Maguire and Borkus were now publishing adverts to make clear the supply of films to pirated kinetoscopes had now been cut, making Paul's machines effectively worthless. And what Acres brought to that meeting was a design he was working on for a machine to do rapid photographic printing, which moved a roll of photographic paper, clamping it for exposure, then letting it go. And Paul thought he could use certain aspects of this, and the two men set to work to come up with some kind of camera as soon as possible. But of course, the pair of them both had demanding businesses to run. But, you know, working all of the hours that there were, they came up with a camera about 6 weeks later, ready to be tested. Well, we don't have any image of that specific camera, but what we do have is a technical drawing and the patent plan for the patent that Birt Acres took out a little bit later. So I'm just going to explain it really, really quickly and hopefully simply to you. So the film comes off here, runs over this wheel with pins in it that engage in the perforations, what you call a sprocket wheel later on, comes down here, gets clamped, and then gets wound another sprocket wheel, wound up there. Okay, right, nice and simple. But there's a couple of very clever things in this camera, and I'm going to show you a video of a replica of the second version of it. It's a teensy bit different. So if you look here, you can see that there. That's a little bit of film being fed out, ready to be pulled down before each exposure. And then you move on, that's the film being clamped as it goes past, and it's pulled down by this thing here, which is kind of just whacking the film out of place, essentially, and pulling it down so it can be wound up. That's the shutter, that big disc you see on the front, and the whole thing is powered by that great big wheel. There you go. It was clever, it was effective, and it worked. As well it should have done, because there was absolutely nothing about it whatsoever that was new. I've long had a problem with this accepted story that Acres and Paul, knowing absolutely nothing about what it was they were about to invent, managed to create it out of thin air from a standing start in just 6 weeks. Not just that, but bearing in mind they were fitting this in around other jobs, they effectively only had 3 working weeks to do what they did. And to give you a comparison, when Edison told Dixon to start working on a camera using a roll of celluloid film, it took them 18 months to get to the first successful test. And then it took them that long again to come up with the substantially different final version. And this is with all the talent and the money and the technical skills at the disposal of Edison. And yet we are supposed to believe that Acres and Paul achieved all this with their limited resources in just 3 to 6 weeks. Well, I don't believe it. And it's easy to identify why Edison, Dixon, and all the other pioneers took so long. It's the research and development period. It's that time that you start with a piece of paper and a wish, and then you rough something out, and then you have another think, and then maybe you do just a little working model, and you have another think, and then maybe you prototype it, you think some more, until you feel you've got what it is that would work. Constructing the final device and making the adjustment so that it functions well, that's the relatively easy and quick part of the entire process. So if time is really against you, and you need a camera as fast as you possibly can, there is only one way to make the time saving. Start with an idea that you already know works. Now then, those of you who were here last year would know that I explained how William Friese-Greene, both on his own and with a couple of civil engineers during 1889 and 1890, worked on a series of motion picture cameras and a related device that I'm going to come to. If you weren't here, it's all on my website. Now, for the sake of simplicity, I'm going to refer to the whole of that work and the relevant patents as the Friese-Greene project. So, let's return to that camera that Akers and Paul had 5 years after Friese-Greene in 1895. My first observation would be that this camera is the same in its layout to all of the cameras in the Friese-Greene project, and yet it is quite different to the cameras that had been described in print from Le Prince, from Donisthorpe and Crofts, and from Edison. Well, I should say that the Friese-Greene cameras had more sophisticated gearing, but that would have taken them more time and been more expensive for them to have done. And remember this thing here about this little loop of film that gets paid out? Well, that was in the very first Friese-Greene project patent, although it was later known as the Latham loop for other reasons. And this thing here with the little thing that knocks the film down, oh well, that's in 3 of the Friese-Greene project patents. And this thing here with the clamping, well, Friese-Greene also at that time created a photographic printing machine, which did, guess what? It moved a roll of photographic paper and then it clamped it for exposure and then released it to let it move on. This was in 1890. It was demonstrated at photographic societies. So there is really, I mean, absolutely all of this would have been described in the photographic press at the time and illustrated as well. And one imagines Birt Akers in his place would be reading that assiduously. And in case you're not sure, well then, have a look at this. This is a page from the British Journal of Photography. There you go. There's an article by Birt Akers running straight into an article by Friese-Greene, which is about, amongst other things, he's talking about his motion picture camera. And he's referring readers back to that year's yearbook, which Birt Akers also contributed to. Anyway, however they did it, about late March 1895, around the same time as the Lumiere brothers were filming the workers leaving their factory, Akers and Paul had a camera and they were raring to try it out. And the location of their first serious filming attempt was a very sensible one, Akers' own home. The house is still there, and I went down with a photographer friend of mine, Simon Warren, to check it out. It wasn't quite in the state we were hoping that it might be outside, but you can see here that building. This is where Elliot and Son were. This bit here would have been their office leading into the works, which stretch out behind, as you can see, just between the two houses there. So it's an eminently sensible place to try out the camera because you can immediately process film and then you can check it. And you've got to bear in mind, there wasn't any 35mm movie film yet. They had to buy big rolls, slit it, perforate it. Robert Paul probably would have built a perforator to do that, but you had to do it in a dark room. Birt Akers would have been the one who was figuring out how to process and print films of 40 to 50 feet in length, which had never been attempted in this country before. Elliot and Sons would have had large developing bars necessary and facilities for drying. Now, as negative stocks were very slow in those days, to give themselves the best chance, they chose a nice sunny day. And one day, probably around the 26th of March, Birt Akers set up his camera right opposite the house. He levelled it off, and he filmed something. But what was it? Now, sadly, all that remains of that first film are fragments in 6 sources in 3 different countries. The most commonly known of these will be this, which was in Talbot's Moving Pictures. Then there is this little bit's up in Bradford. This frame here is in the Kodak collection. All of this is reproduced in the John Barnes book, The Beginnings of the Cinema in England. There's these 3 frames found in Leeds. And there's this strip, which is in the film archivist Will Day's unpublished book, 25,000 Years to Trap a Shadow. Day erroneously describes it as being cricketer jumping over garden gates, which is stuck. Well, as you can see, there definitely is somebody dressed in cricket white, and there is a gate, but there's no jumping going on. But what we do know from actually things that Birt scribbled in the margin of Talbot's book is that the person in the pictures is, if you have a look, it's none other than Henry Short, who was probably assisting him that day, as he would do at many, many times in the future. So what I was wondering is, what happens, well, what is happening in what order when you put it all together? All the pieces of film seem to have absolutely identical framing, but thanks to research with Simon, we established that not all the pieces were shot at the same time. If you have a look, this is on the left, you've got, this is Annie Akers pushing their one-year-old Winifred down the road. And if you have a look, you can see that the shadows here are going very distinctly from the right to the left. This is in fact shot about 8 a.m. And the rest of it, the sun is almost straight on, coming very slightly from the left. You can see the shadow there under his legs, that's going slightly left to right. A significant time difference suggests that perhaps Birt ran a test to check that everything was fine and then developed it just before he started. Whatever exactly did happen, what we do know is the main test was at 11 a.m. And it was a success. And after they'd shot the film and printed it, as recounted in Ian Christie's graphic novel that no doubt he's going to try and give you or sell you later today, later that night, they put it in the kinetoscope, they ran it, and they got so excited about it that a policeman came off the street to see what the fuss was about. Now, Akers said that he shot all this at 40 frames a second, but I wondered if that was so. And I also began to wonder if any of these pieces actually fitted together, and I realised while sitting on a plane to Australia that the Will Day frames were contiguous with the frames in Talbot. And I thought, well, I wonder if I could stitch them together. And then I thought, all right, well, let's export them at a variety of speeds and see which speed looks like the right one. But clearly, this is not something I could decide alone, so I decided I would bring in a team of early film history experts, and luckily you all showed up. So, this is what we're going to do. You're going to see a very teeny-weeny snippet of a film over and over and over and over again. And it's going to gradually get slower, then it's going to gradually get faster again. And what I want you all to do is when the movement starts to feel about right to you, raise your hand. And when you get to the point of, no, that's wrong again, put it down. That should happen twice. Once it slows down, once it speeds up. Okay, don't worry about what anybody else is doing, just do whatever you feel is right. And this is either going to be brilliant or the most embarrassing moment of my life. So, ready with your hands. When you feel that it starts to look right, please raise your hands. Still very skeptical. Okay. Right, okay. Jolly good. So this is the slowest. Now it's going to start to speed up again. Let's see what happens. Must get quite tired doing all that, doesn't he? Right, well, that seems pretty clear. There was definitely a lot of clustering around D and E on the screen. And checking my notes here, I shall tell you what speeds D and E were. D is 17.5 frames a second, E is 15 frames a second. So, averaging that out, we're talking about something like 16 frames a second. So that is absolutely nothing like the 46 frames a second that's supposed to be for the kinetoscope. And yet, we know for sure they were making these films for the kinetoscope. Now, what you've got to remember is that the Edison-Dixon kinetograph camera, as it was known, was a heavily engineered industrial-style piece of equipment powered by electricity, whereas what we have here is something distinctly more low-tech, powered by a hand-cranking system. Speeds of 40 frames a second were simply impossible with this system. But just to be sure, I thought, well, I'm just going to double check. I had a look at every piece of film shot by Birt with that camera or the one immediately after it that we can feel confident of, and all of them seem to be running around 15, 17, average about 16 frames a second. But the speed of the kinetoscope could very easily be varied, and the result for the reviewer actually probably would simply be that the images weren't quite as crisp as when you saw the Edison ones. There might have been a little bit of flicker, but they certainly would have portrayed very convincing motion. And that would have still been incredibly impressive to the average viewer, who, remember, had never seen anything like this in their life. I don't know about you, but I always wondered, like, how could Paul and Akers project these early films the next year at 16 frames a second without anybody commenting, well, only why comment, that they looked slow, because they should have looked slow. Well, now we know the reason why. They were actually shot at what would become projection speed, and then they were shown in Paul's slowed down kinetoscopes. So let's take a little look at those fragments, running at about the speed you've been talking about, just these little snippets, just so you can see. So, first of all, here we've got Annie not getting very far down the road, 8 o'clock in the morning. Then Henry Short shows up. There he is, closing the gate. He's not jumping it. And then he's walking away from the house. He's got something in his hands. Can you see? He's still walking away. He's got something in his hands. The maid's going down into the garden and up again. The garden bit has gone now, and then up into the house. But clearly that's not the whole story. So Simon and I were thinking, well, all right, let's just, how might it have gone? So thought, well, okay, so presumably, Annie must have come all the way down past the house, and then, a bit later, Henry must appear from somewhere, comes up the road, opens the gate, closes it again. No, none of this rude jumping stuff. And then I presume must go up and knock at the door. But then we don't really know, because next thing you know, he's walking up the road, the maid's going into the house. We don't know if she does anything else. I don't really know if she shuts the door. And of course, what we really don't know is what he was holding in his hands. And that, I guess, will just have to remain one of those mysteries of cinema history. So, what have you learnt today? Well, I'd say, first of all, don't believe everything that proud parents say about the running speed of their offspring. And it also turns out that it wasn't as simple a conception as it first appears, because there does seem to have been egg implantation from a third party. And despite how promising the relationship initially seems, just 2 months after this triumphant achievement, having shot a bunch of films, it all fell dramatically apart. There are accusations and counter-accusations in the press about who was responsible for the breakup, and there was a very, very ugly custody battle. But I'm happy to say that despite that, as you all well know, the kid went from strength to strength. Thank you very much.